Consideration.
Without objection.
Mr. Speaker, I yield myself such time as I may consume.
Without objection.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. This debate was a long time coming, not because it's complicated, but because Democrats couldn't accept the solution. We are here at the 11th hour, finally dealing with the debt limit on a bipartisan basis because President Biden apparently needed 100 days to pick up the phone to talk to Republicans. During those 100 days, the case for cutting spending as part of a debt ceiling increase has only grown stronger. We have seen the worst inflation crisis in a generation, the direct result of reckless spending, continue to rob the pocketbooks of working families. We have seen interest rates continue to rise, driving up the cost of purchasing a car, a home, or small business loan. Interest payments on our national debt is $110 billion higher over the first 7 months of this fiscal year than they were over the same time last fiscal year. In other words, runaway spending is adding to our debt crisis on the front end and the back end. Something else occurred during those 100 days. House Republicans took action. While the White House was saying they would only accept a blank check debt ceiling increase, an idea that did not and does not have the votes, even in a Senate controlled by the president's own party. House Republicans, they passed a responsible plan to address the debt ceiling while cutting spending and supporting American workers. We acted on behalf of working families that are tired of paying more to put gas in their cars, clothes on their backs, and food on their tables. We acted on behalf of the small business owners who are desperate to remove the help wanted signs in their storefront windows. And we acted on behalf of the families trapped on government assistance to help provide them with a path to a more prosperous future. One has to wonder, what was President Biden waiting for? A massive slowdown in the economy? Well, we got that too. In the first quarter of this year, economic growth slowed significantly to just over 1%. But these data points do not tell the full story. To get that, you have to go into the communities across this country and listen to those on the front lines of the economy. At the Ways and Means Committee, we have done just that. From West Virginia to Oklahoma, Georgia to New York, we have listened to American workers, families, farmers, and small business owners who have shared their concerns and their solutions. And at the heart of so much of what we have heard is the simple message: stop spending money we do not have on policies that do not work. According to a recent survey, 60% of the American people say that an increase in the nation's debt limit ought to be accompanied by a reduction in the nation's spending. The Fiscal Responsibility Act is a step in responding to that request. It does much of what Republicans said we would do: put a check on Washington spending, claw back the pandemic-era funding that everyone should agree is no longer needed, take a bite out of the IRS's recent $80 billion pay raise, severely dampen the regulatory administrative state, and lift more Americans out of poverty through common sense work requirements for those who can work. Does this bill do everything folks might want? No, but I'm reminded of a quote by Thomas Jefferson, where he said in part, "The ground of liberty is to be gained by inches," that we must be content to secure what we can get from time to time and eternally press forward for what is yet to get. This bill keeps alive the precedent that was set decades ago and has been upheld by Republicans and Democrats alike. Even President Biden, when he was a senator and when he was vice president. And that is, when it comes to addressing the nation's debt limit, Congress and the White House need to come to the table to also help address the nation's debt crisis. I reserve the balance of my time.
Gentleman reserves. The gentleman from Massachusetts, Mr. Neal, is recognized.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Mr. Speaker, I yield myself as much time as I might consume. And let me point out, as the chairman noted, the chairman said that he didn't have the whole story. So we intend to spend the next hour filling in the rest of the story. We are here tonight because of a reckless position that was adopted by the majority that was prepared to take this nation to the precipice of default. And thank goodness for Joe Biden's legislative skill, we will not go over the edge. We will preserve the full faith and credit of the United States. Just think of what was being proposed here. Risk as the dollar, as the international currency? Do people have any idea what the treasuries play in terms of international transactions? The American dollar drives the world's economy, and they were prepared to take us over the edge with a reckless spending plan that they had. Well, thanks to Leader Jeffries and the measured tone that he took, we find ourselves tonight with an agreement that we might not love because it's not about perfection. And I stopped telling people that I was perfect 46 years ago when I ran for the Springfield City Council. After one legislative session, I never professed being perfect again. There is give and take to negotiation, and it means precisely that. You give and you take. And that's what we are acknowledging here this evening. That old sage of political thought got it right. Mick Jagger, you get what you need. So Democrats can proudly say tonight, with the help of Joe Biden, that we protected Social Security, we protected Medicare, we protected Medicaid, and we protected veterans' benefits, all of which we have profoundly embraced over these years. So how do we get here? This is about the CARES Act that saved the American economy. 22 million jobs gone, now 22 million jobs returned, and 9.5 million jobs going unanswered. This was a manufactured crisis that brings us to this evening. The President's experienced leadership in the face of a divided government in this body is 1/2 of the federal government. We still have a ways to go, but let's talk about why the bill ran up. So the CARES Act. Republicans voted for more defense spending. Republicans, some of whom voted for the CHIPS Act and some of whom voted for the infrastructure bill. And let me point out something, and I hope everybody's paying attention to this. In December of 2017, Republicans borrowed $2.3 trillion to provide a tax cut to the wealthiest among us. You know what the great irony of that is? Even the wealthy wouldn't say they were asking for that tax cut. That's how we got here. Their Default on America Act, in an effort to balance the budget on hardworking Americans' backs, tonight will be compromised. They targeted food security and health care while ignoring tax loopholes. And do you think around here we might someday close one tax loophole? The tax bill that we put out was well received everywhere, and it was pro-growth in nature. But let me also point out something else by historic record this evening. Republicans are always in favor, Mr. Speaker, of balancing the budget when there's a Democratic president. That's the reality of it. Let's not forget who put us in this situation. In the last 25 years, Republicans have voted for $10 trillion worth of tax cuts to the top 1%. 2001, $1.3 trillion. 2003, $1 trillion. And then their tax plan in December of 2017, $2.3 trillion of borrowed money. They wanted to take the American economy hostage, and Joe Biden and Leader Jeffries and the Democratic caucus pushed back to make sure that the position that we have tonight, which we overwhelmingly intend to support, is reasonable policy achieved because of the hard-nosed negotiating of President Biden and Leader Jeffries. And with that, I reserve the balance of my time.
Gentleman reserves. Gentleman from Missouri is recognized.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. I'm pleased to yield 3 minutes to the gentleman who spent hours and days and weeks in the negotiation process to help get us to where we are today. The gentleman from North Carolina, Mr. McHenry.
Gentleman's recognized.
I want to thank Chairman Smith for yielding time. For the first time in debt limit negotiations, the U.S. government will spend less money next year than it did this year. This rates as one of the largest deficit reduction bills in American history. And it will fundamentally change the spending trajectory here in Washington, with more work to do and more work ahead. The bill contains spending cuts that take a step in the right direction towards restoring fiscal sanity in Washington. This agreement will return discretionary spending to 2022 levels. Additionally, we set top-line spending at 1% annual growth over the next 6 years. We also cut spending through the largest funding rescissions in American history, clawing back billions of dollars in unspent COVID money. We institute the first-ever statutory administrative pay-go to hold President Biden accountable for his administrative action. If this rule had been in place over the last 2 years, it would have checked the regulatory overreach that has cost the economy at least $1.5 trillion during Biden's presidency. This agreement will also change the way Washington operates by compelling a workable appropriations process. Simply put, this legislation ends Democrats' spending spree and fights inflation. This deal will also help grow our economy and lift Americans out of poverty by instituting the strongest work requirements in a generation on some of our social safety net programs. These reforms will combat the labor shortages crippling small businesses by encouraging individuals to contribute to our society and economy while preserving these programs for those that need them most. Another pro-growth solution in this bill is the transformational reforms to the permitting process and the environmental review process. Cutting this red tape will boost domestic energy production, lower costs for struggling American families, and set us on a path towards energy independence. Furthermore, it will be faster, cheaper, and easier to build things in America, large and small. Whether that's infrastructure, roads, bridges, new homes, new factories, so be it. This legislation, though, is a product of divided government. Republicans only control the House of Representatives, not the Senate, not the White House. And throughout this process, which was long, laborious, and tough, it's been Speaker McCarthy's leadership and House Republicans leading. We passed a plan, and it was that plan and the Speaker's leadership that enabled these negotiations and this agreement. This is the most conservative spending package during my time in Congress, and I'm proud to support it. And I encourage my colleagues to vote yes and yield back.
The gentleman from Missouri yield. Reserve. Great. The gentleman from Missouri reserve.
Yes, reserve.
The gentleman from
Thank you,
Massachusetts
Mr. Speaker.
recognized.
It's an honor for me to introduce the Democratic leader for a leader's 1 minute, Mr. Jeffries.
Mr. Jeffries is recognized for 1 minute.
I thank the distinguished gentleman from the Commonwealth of Massachusetts for yielding, and I thank Mr. Neal for his tremendous, steadfast leadership in this moment of crisis that was manufactured by extreme MAGA Republicans on the other side of the aisle. I thank the distinguished members of the Ways and Means Committee. I thank House Democrats for your steady hand, for your unity of purpose, for your efforts to make sure that we push back the extreme MAGA Republican efforts to jam right-wing cuts down the throats of the American people that would have undermined the health, the safety, and the economic well-being of everyday Americans. From the very beginning, House Democrats were clear that we would not allow extreme MAGA Republicans to default on our debt, crash the economy, or trigger a job-killing recession. Under the leadership of President Joe Biden, Democrats kept our promise. And we will continue to do what is necessary to put people over politics. The question that remains right now is, what will the House Republican majority do? It appears that you may have lost control of the floor of the House of Representatives. Earlier today, 29 House Republicans voted to default on our nation's debt and against an agreement that you negotiated. It's an extraordinary act that indicates just the nature of the extremism that is out of control on the other side of the aisle. Extreme MAGA Republicans attempted to take control of the House floor, Democrats took it back for the American people. And we will continue to do what is necessary under the leadership of President Joe Biden to build an economy that works for everyday Americans and push back against the extremism on the other side of the aisle. Under the Trump administration, Democrats helped the former president avoid a default, raise the debt ceiling 3 times without gamesmanship, partisanship, or brinksmanship, because Democrats put people over politics. Even though we strongly disagreed with your reckless policies, as Chairman Neal eloquently outlined. 2017, you passed the GOP tax scam, where 83% of the benefits went to the wealthiest 1% here in America, and caused our nation to go $2 trillion in debt to subsidize the lifestyles of the wealthy, the well-off, and the well-connected. Did nothing to lift up the economy for everyday Americans. And that's been the case with your so-called tax cuts under Ronald Reagan, and that was the case under George W. Bush. Failed policy, trickle-down economics that has come to mean only one thing for everyday Americans. You may get a trickle, but you're guaranteed to stay down. The policies have failed. And yet, despite that failure, despite the fact that you went $2 trillion into debt to pass your GOP tax scam, House Democrats were there to make sure that America did not default. We were there then, and we are there today to put people over politics. And so I'm thankful for my colleagues, for their work, for their commitment, for their patriotism, for their dedication, for their willingness to find the common ground necessary under the leadership of President Joe Biden, who did an extraordinary job under very difficult circumstances to protect values of importance to the American people, notwithstanding your threats to crash the economy, trigger a recession, default on our debt. Because President Biden understood, despite the hostage-taking situation that you unnecessarily thrust the country into, that we had an obligation, a responsibility to avoid a catastrophic default. That's exactly what President Biden and Democrats have been able to do. We also made clear that America would not find ourselves back in this hostage-taking situation. You passed the Default on America Act about a month ago that had extreme right-wing cuts.
Members, including leadership, are reminded to direct the remarks to the chair.
Mr. Speaker, I did not mention any single member by name or any single individual on the other side of the aisle. Mr. Speaker,
Chair.
Mr. Speaker, as I've indicated on this floor, House Democrats will continue to put people over politics and push back against the extremism on the other side of the aisle. And I'm thankful for the leadership of President Joe Biden in avoiding a catastrophic default. I'm thankful for the leadership of President Joe Biden in finding our way to an agreement that will avoid a hostage-taking situation for the balance of the 118th Congress. And I'm thankful for the leadership of President Joe Biden and House Democrats, who protected Social Security, protected Medicare, protected Medicaid, protected veterans benefits, protected education, protected public safety, and protected the American people from the draconian 22% across-the-board cuts that House Republicans were trying to visit on everyday Americans. And as a result of that effort, that leadership of President Joe Biden, We're going to be able to get through this hostage-taking situation and ensure that we can continue to build an economy that works for everyday Americans. I thank House Democrats for their leadership. I thank House Democrats for their work. And we will continue to show up and stand up and speak up without fear for everyday Americans and to ensure that we can continue America's long, necessary, and majestic march toward a more perfect union. I yield back.
Does the gentleman from Massachusetts reserve?
We continue to reserve, Mr. Speaker.
The gentleman from Missouri is recognized.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. I yield 3 minutes to a gentleman who has worked for days and weeks to get us where we're at today. The gentleman from Louisiana, Mr. Graves.
Gentleman's recognized.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Mr. Chairman, thank you for yielding. I want to explain why we're in the situation that we're in today. We've watched over the last year as my friends across the aisle have pushed through legislation called the IIJA, called the IRA, the CHIPS Act, the ARP, all these acronyms. And what it means to you, what it means to the American people, Mr. Speaker, is it means that $10 trillion in extra funds have been spent. $10 trillion. Let me tell you what that means. Today, a child born in America is going to inherit about $4.5 million in debt at their birth. $4.5 million, the amount of money they're going to pay over their lifetime, according to the Committee for a Responsible Federal Budget. Right now, we have hit our credit card limit as a nation. We don't have the ability to pay the monthly payment. And so we're in a quandary. We've got to figure out how we're going to raise that credit card limit. And just like you would do with your own family, you would have a conversation, Mr. Speaker, with your child, and you would say, hey, how did you get yourself in this situation? We've got to fix it. Look, the situation we're in right now, we have 4 options in front of us. There are 4. Number 1, we can default on the debt. You cannot pay your credit card bill, which means late payment penalties, interest rates going up, and you cause havoc on the American family. Second option is you can say, hey, we're going to use this 14th Amendment thing that doesn't really exist, and the president can just do it on his own. Third option is you can get all the moderates, you can get them together, they can do a relatively clean debt ceiling and just keeps that debt going up and up and up from $32 trillion today to $52 trillion over the next 20 years or so. 17.5 cents of every tax dollar paid over the next 10 years is going to go toward interest on the debt. 17.5 cents. The third option we have is, again, a clean debt ceiling and just running it up. The fourth option we have, the one that's before us today, the Fiscal Responsibility Act. It is absolutely historic for the first time ever as a result of the strategic nature of this speaker. We're in a situation where we have legislation before us that will result in the greatest savings in American history, that will result in the greatest rescission or taking back of funds in our nation's history. We have legislation before us today that will strengthen and instill work requirements for welfare. We have legislation before us today that will rescind funds for additional IRS agents, because I have never had a constituent say, gosh, I wish I could have more audits. We have legislation before us today that for the first time in 40 years streamlines the environmental process. Mr. Speaker, here it is. Historic efforts to raise the deficit. $6.5 trillion is how much this one resulted in. This one, $2 trillion in savings. This is the option. There's not an imaginary fifth option, Mr. Speaker. It doesn't exist.
Gentleman's time has expired.
The American people support this legislation. Yield back.
Is the gentleman from Missouri reserve?
Reserve.
Gentleman from Massachusetts,
Thank you,
recognized.
Mr. Speaker. The previous gentleman left out infrastructure spending, the CARES Act, defense spending, the CHIPS Act, and the VETS Act, all of whom had Republican support in terms of the expenditure. And Bill Clinton balanced the budget 4 straight times during his presidency, and the money was given away with big tax cuts in 2001 and 2003. With that, let me recognize the gentleman from Texas, Mr. Doggett, for 1 minute.
Gentleman's recognized.
Protecting our country's full faith and credit requires accepting some unacceptable Republican demands. As one cartoonist aptly described them, Republicans suffer from a form of deficit attention disorder. You see, when Democrats are in charge, they are absolutely obsessed with deficits. But give them a little power and their attention, poof, it just magically vanishes as they begin to deplete the Treasury with tax gifts for the well-connected. Like their multi-trillion-dollar Trump tax giveaway, they're already planning in coming days to soon borrow more to reward those at the top. Their boundless affection for tax cheats and for tax expenditures may increase the debt by even more than the cuts that they make today in education, health care, and environmental protection, which are so wrong. As climate deniers, these Republicans sought to repeal our climate law, but were held to one pipeline and a weakening of environmental review laws, a troubling setback that we can overcome. We should be leaping forward instead of moving slowly.
The gentleman's time has
Ransom
expired.
paid, America protected.
Continue to reserve, Mr. Speaker.
The gentleman from Missouri is recognized.
I yield 1 minute to the gentleman from North Carolina, Dr. Murphy.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. I rise today in support of the Fiscal Responsibility Act. Over 100 days ago, President Biden said he would not negotiate. Acting on behalf of this country, Republicans forced him to negotiate. The bill alters our fiscal trajectory and helps remedy the federal government's insatiable spending problem. This landmark legislation lowers non-defense discretionary spending and forces Congress to employ a functioning appropriation process. More importantly, the measure doesn't result in new taxes, doesn't touch Social Security, Medicare, or veterans' benefits. Is the bill perfect? Absolutely not. Is it a step in the right direction? Absolutely. CBO scores a decrease in spending of $1.9 trillion. Let's not forget, Rome was not built in a day. It's now up to Republicans to make the necessary cuts to bring in our terrible spending and our terrible debt of $31 trillion. I urge my colleagues to support this landmark legislation. Thank you. I yield back.
Gentleman reserved.
Reserve.
Gentleman from
Thank you, Mr.
Massachusetts.
Speaker. I yield 2 minutes to the gentleman from California, Congressman Thompson, who spent 6 hours in front of the Rules Committee.
Thank the gentleman for yielding. Mr. Speaker, the American people can't afford a default. Default on our debt would be catastrophic, an economic disaster with consequences for every one of our constituents. Congress can't let that happen. This bill's not perfect, but thanks to President Biden's leadership, the bill before us achieves 2 key points. One, it prevents default, averting an economic disaster. And 2, it preserves not only key programs like Social Security, Medicare, and Medicaid, but also maintains virtually all House Democrats' achievements from the last 2 years, including the climate provisions of the Inflation Reduction Act, which I was proud to author with my colleagues in the Ways and Means Committee. Despite where Republicans started, the President has negotiated legislation that protects Medicaid and the Inflation Reduction Act, the CHIPS Act, the PACT Act, which provides for veterans' health care. Now, I share some of my colleagues' concerns with the bill. I'm particularly opposed to the Republicans' demand to cut mental health care. After climate change, mental health is the single biggest crisis in our country. There is no reason to cut critical funding for mental health. And their cuts to the IRS will not decrease the deficit, it will increase the deficit. A fully funded IRS is in everyone's best interest. Overall, this legislation is a compromise, which is what the American people expect and deserve from a divided government. And most important, it averts the catastrophe of a default. I urge my colleagues to support this bill, and I yield back the balance of my time.
We continue to reserve, Mr. Speaker.
Gentleman from Missouri is recognized.
I yield 1 minute to the gentleman from Utah, Mr. Moore.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. When I ran for Congress, I ran on the promise that I would use my position to reverse Washington's debt culture. In my first term, I was in the minority party. And after 2 years of voting against Democrat spending proposals, I finally today get the opportunity to vote yes on a comprehensive and thoughtful piece of legislation that will serve as the most significant spending cut in American history. Does this bill achieve everything that I want? No, of course not. That's the reality, but my support is a significant step forward, reversing our ballooning national debt. The Fiscal Responsibility Act allows us to cut spending by $2.1 trillion over the next decade. It's the largest deficit reduction ever. And in my first time in 40 years, we will be able to address our permitting process, to be able to address our energy sector and transportation projects from crippling regulations. This act represents the beginning of what is to come as Republicans govern in a responsible, productive manner. We fought hard to get this agreement and blew through Democrats' red lines over and over again. This isn't over. We can responsibly govern, and success today will bring more success in the future. I look forward to casting my vote yes, and I yield back.
Reserve.
Gentleman reserves. Gentleman from Massachusetts is
Thank you,
recognized.
Mr. Speaker. It's an honor for me to introduce for 1 minute the gentleman from Connecticut and my neighbor, Mr. Larson.
The gentleman is recognized.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. 3 times President Biden has had to deal with the Republican manufactured default crisis around raising the debt ceiling. Since 1960, Congress has dealt with the debt ceiling 78 times, and during the Trump administration alone, it raised the debt ceiling 3 times without holding the American economy and its people hostage. President Biden is to be commended for being the adult in the room and providing the leadership to prevent a catastrophic default that hurts the U.S. standing in the global economy and Americans here at home. That does not excuse the behavior of the Republican majority in the House who seek to normalize hostage-taking in an effort to hurt programs that serve our people the most. Thank you, President Biden, for protecting Social Security, Medicare, and veterans benefits. The trust the American people place in you has been validated again.
Reserve.
Continue to reserve, Mr. Speaker.
Thank you. Gentleman from Missouri is recognized.
I yield 1 minute to the gentleman from Nebraska, Mr. Smith.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. I rise to support this legislation. The debt ceiling is one of the best pathways to address debt and deficits. In addition to immediate spending cuts and future spending caps, this bill includes provisions to prevent IRS from auditing families and small businesses and helps get Americans back to work. My bill with Representative Steele to rescind IRS funding was partially put into this bill, and even though we passed the entire bill by a majority in January, parts of it are in this bill, and House Republicans continue to work to protect every family and small business from IRS overreach. This bill also modernizes TANF work requirements and ends the scheme of states sending small dollar checks to people who are already working to artificially raise their TANF work rates. These changes will focus TANF dollars on those who need it the most and will push states to do more to connect work-capable adults with the 9.6 million job openings we have across our economy right now. We have more to do to get our work done and our fiscal house in order. We need to ensure our economy always rewards hard work, and this bill is a great start. I yield back.
Expired.
I reserve.
Gentleman from
Thank you,
Massachusetts
Mr.
is
Speaker.
recognized.
It's an honor for me to yield 1 minute to one of the most accomplished speakers of the House in the history of America, the gentlelady from California, Ms. Pelosi.
Gentlelady is recognized.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. I thank the gentleman for yielding and for his leadership, and that Mr. Boyd, the chair of our Budget Committee, as well. Mr. Speaker, I associate myself with the great remarks of our distinguished leader, Mr. Hakeem Jeffries, who spoke earlier and captured so much of what is so important here today. Mr. Speaker, our Constitution makes perfectly clear the validity of the public debt of the United States shall not be questioned. And the bipartisan budget agreement, we honor our sworn oath as lawmakers to uphold this constitutional duty. While I find this legislation objectionable, it will avert an unprecedented default, which would bring devastation to America's families, millions of jobs eliminated, trillions in savings erased, higher costs on loans, mortgages, car payments, credit card bills, and more. And let us commend President Biden for his responsible leadership to prevent this unconscionable outcome while protecting Social Security, Medicare, Medicaid, protecting health care for our veterans as our Commander-in-Chief, climate, infrastructure, our economy.
The gentlelady's time
I urge
has
our
expired.
colleagues to support the full faith and credit of the United States. It shall not be
Gentlelady's time has
questioned.
expired.
I yield back.
Thank you. The gentleman from Missouri is recognized.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. I'm pleased to yield 1 minute to the gentleman who has worked numerous hours, days. In fact, he's been working since January to get where we're at today. And we're pleased to have the gentleman from California, Speaker McCarthy.
Gentleman's recognized.
Mr. Speaker, let me first say how grateful I am to Congressman Graves and Mr. McHenry. They have given their time and talents to the efforts for more than a month. Our entire conference and country owes them a debt of gratitude. And to my conference, thank you. You worked hard. When I went to see the President on February 1st, sat in the Oval Office right in the chair across. I said, Mr. President, the debt limit's coming. At that time, Janet Yellen said it'd be into maybe August, July. I said we should work together. I said there's only two things, Mr. President. Never raise taxes, and we have to spend less than we spent this year. He said we would meet, but for 97 days, we would never meet. It wasn't until this House took action to pass. I sit back and I think for one moment, what if that bill didn't pass because nothing passed in the Senate? If that bill had not passed, the only other option is sitting over here in a discharge position. Just needs a few more signatures, and it would be just raise the debt. Just raise the debt. But tonight is going to be different. Tonight we're going to do something we haven't done before. Tonight we're going to give America hope. Tonight we are going to vote for the largest savings in American history, over $2.1 trillion. That's what we'll vote on. Mr. Speaker, every great nation that has overextended itself has collapsed. Mindful of this truth, George Washington said in his farewell address that a healthy public credit is a source of strength and security for a nation. By that same token, an unhealthy debt burden is a source of weakness and insecurity. President Washington's words ring true today. We're seeing the negative effects of runaway spending in real time. Record inflation, rising interest rates, broken supply chains, and economic uncertainty. Runaway spending is also making America more dependent on foreign debt holders. The total debt we owe to other countries is $7.4 trillion. Countries like China are buying more of our farmland, more of our businesses, and more of our debt. This is unsustainable, but what's even worse, it is dangerous. But runaway spending is more than an economic and national security problem. My belief, Mr. Speaker, it is a moral problem. Mr. Speaker, this is Haley. Haley was born at 9:58 a.m. on April 11th of this year. She weighed 6 pounds and 7 ounces. Her blue eyes, she got that from her dad. That button nose, she got that from her mom. And the $95,000 bill, she got that from Washington. Not a very good gift for a newborn. That's Haley's portion of the national debt. And sadly, Haley is not alone. Every child who is born today owes $95,000 in debt. Mr. Speaker, that's $10,000 more in debt for every child since this president took office. It reminds me of what Ronald Reagan once said. When a business or an individual spends more than it makes, it goes bankrupt. When government does it, it sends you the bill. Mr. Speaker, to continue Washington's spending addiction is both irresponsible and just wrong. So let's stop it. I'll be honest, tonight's bill doesn't stop it. But for the first time, we begin to turn the ship. This shouldn't be our last. It shouldn't even be a debate. We should challenge each other for how could we put ourselves on a fiscal path even better. For months, President Biden and Senator Schumer were adamant that they would not negotiate spending cuts. Mr. Speaker, I remember watching Senator Schumer on George Stephanopoulos one Sunday. He said, just watch. We're going to break them. The Republicans can't get together. They can't pass a bill. And it's going to be a clean debt ceiling. You just watch. The only person that didn't pass the bill was the person who made that quote. They demanded a clean debt limit, which really means they spend more and you just pay more in taxes. House Republicans said no. Over the past 4 months, we fought hard to change how Washington works. We stopped the Democrats from writing a blank check for more spending after the largest spending binge in American history. That brought us some of the worst inflation our nation has ever known. We used the power we had to force the president to negotiate. You would watch me day after day requesting to negotiate with the president. We produced a bill that in divided government takes a step towards smaller government, less regulation, more economic growth, and more take-home pay. And unlike previous speakers, you don't have to pass the bill to find out what's in it. You had 72 hours to read it, and it's only 99 pages. 15 of those pages were just rescissions. Just money that we had spent that sat there. Here's the bottom line, Mr. Speaker. The Fiscal Responsibility Act is the biggest spending cut in American history. I, for one, Mr. Speaker, don't want to be on the wrong side of history. Yeah, I could say, I'm going to vote no because there's something not in the bill. If I took that philosophy, I would never vote yes. I simply read the bills in front of me and decide, is this good for the country? I would say that answer is easily yes. Taxpayers will save an additional $2.1 trillion, and for the first time in more than a decade, Congress will spend less next year than this year. In fact, Fiscal Responsibility Act is the only bill that reduces overall spending, reduces non-defense spending, and reduces the deficit unlike any other debt limit increase in recent history. We're finally bending the curve on discretionary spending because of this bill. And we're doing it while at the same time raising our national defense and our veterans fully funded, with Social Security and Medicare preserved, and without raising a penny in new taxes. That is a major victory. And Mr. Speaker, it's only part of the story. Tens of billions of dollars in unspent COVID funds will be clawed back for the taxpayers because of this bill's spending rescissions, the largest in American history. If you add up all the rescissions in American history and you add them together, this is larger than that. I think it's only common sense that if the pandemic is over, but the billions of dollars have not been spent, why would you spend them now if the pandemic's over? Why don't we provide them back to the hardworking taxpayer that has to pay it? Like Allie. And Mr. Speaker, just listen to some of the programs we're slashing. $400 million from the CDC's Global Health Fund. Don't get worried, because that's not going to help you. That's your hard-working taxpayer money being spent to countries like China. I guess that's to help China be able to buy our bonds, and we'll pay for their health care. I'd rather focus on America. Or what about work-capable adults without dependents? They're going to get a job, they're going to learn new skills, and they're going to earn a paycheck because of this bill's new welfare reforms. These reforms are going to change people's lives. When you vote on this bill today, somebody's going to have a better job tomorrow because of your vote. Families will be stronger and more self-sufficient. People will be lifted out of poverty. Don't believe anyone who says our plan hurts America's social safety net. We are such a generous nation. And when people fall on tough times, we help them. That will not change. But this is an important assistance. Programs are supposed to be temporary, not permanent. A hand up, not a handout. A bridge to independence, not a barrier. If you also vote for this bill tonight, new roads, new bridges, and highways and pipelines, they're going to be built sooner and faster because of this bill's permitting reform. Mr. Speaker, I know that is a bipartisan view. We talk about it all the time. We see it in our homes. We get frustrated that you'll vote for a transportation bill, you'll serve 10 years in the Congress, and once you leave, the person who followed you 6 years later will be at the groundbreaking because we spent all that time studying. I think America wants to compete. They want to cut the red tape. They just want a fair process. This is going to save families money and make America less dependent on China. Changing America for the better for decades to come. Finally, taxpayers will be more protected from harassment and costly new burdens. We rejected every single one of President Biden's demands for new tax hikes and new government mandates. And believe me, from the person sitting in the room with the president, he asked every single time. Instead, this bill eliminates the funding that would have been spent this year to hire Biden's army of new IRS agents. Overall, we've cut more than $20 billion from Biden's IRS slush fund. To date, they haven't been able to hire a single one of Biden's 87,000 new IRS agents. And I'll come back year after year to keep it that way. Because the government should work for you, not go after you. Mr. Speaker, passing the Fiscal Responsibility Act is a crucial first step for putting America back on track. It does what is responsible for our children, what is possible in divided government, and what is required by our principles and promises. Yes, it may not include everything we need to do, but it is absolutely what we need to do right now. Moving forward, House Republicans will build on its structural reforms. And as we do, the American people can be confident in this: I'm never giving up. I heard the detractors. I'm an optimist. You have to be. I sat there 15 rounds. I'm an optimist. I waited 97 days and listened to the president tell me he will never meet with me. But I woke up every morning thinking this might be the day. I'm an optimist that I watched division in this house. But tonight, we might come together to do something very big for this nation. Don't mistake it that it's the solution. It's the beginning. And we should wake up the next morning on how we could do better even tomorrow. You see, I will never give up on the American people. and I will never give up on keeping our commitment to America. With that, I yield back.
Does the gentleman from Missouri reserve? The gentleman from Massachusetts is recognized.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. I want to yield 1 minute to the gentleman from Oregon, a champion of the Inflation Reduction Act and the tax credits that were included, Mr. Blumenauer.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. It's amazing how the Republicans can make political drama appear smaller than life. Major questions with extremists are reduced to parody and political theater. We may have averted catastrophe, but it doesn't mean there was not a real cost to America. We should commit to never again allow such political hostage-taking. Instead, led the foundation for using the clear language of the 14th Amendment to avoid the debt ceiling altogether. We should collect billions of dollars already payable from some of the wealthiest individuals and corporations. It would be a strong signal about the fairness of our tax system. It's ironic that Republicans are worried about pressing rich people for taxes they already owe, but would subject poor people to more harassment and meaningless paperwork. We should instead concentrate on changing policies that would reduce the deficit. If there will be time limits on benefits, maybe we could start with 20,000 rich farmers who got $1 million a year or more for 37 consecutive years. If we act in good faith, it shouldn't be so hard, and America will be the better.
Does the gentleman reserve? Gentleman from Missouri is recognized.
I yield 1 minute to the gentleman from Louisiana, Majority Leader Scalise.
Gentleman's recognized.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker, and thank my friend from Missouri for yielding and for his leadership on this bill. Mr. Speaker, for the first time in years, this Congress is actually debating a bill that will reduce spending from 1 year to the next. Let me repeat it. Reduce spending from 1 year to the next. That's not something you hear around this town often. Usually the debate is, how much more money will Washington spend? And in fact, if Republicans were not in the majority in this House, that's exactly the debate that would be going on. How much more to spend, how many more taxes to raise, because that's what President Biden wanted at the outset of this debate on the debt ceiling. And just for a little background, let's be clear what the debt ceiling is. The debt ceiling is the nation's credit card. And for the last 2 years, you saw out-of-control, reckless spending to the tune of trillions of dollars, where President Biden and his allies racked up so much debt that they maxed out the nation's credit card. And so we're at this point to address that problem. But, Mr. Speaker, wouldn't it make sense at the same time that we're addressing the problem that President Biden created with years of spending money that we don't have, that we also have an honest discussion and start solving the problem that caused the nation to max out the credit card? That's what this debate has been about for the last few months. And frankly, I think it's a debate that has been a long time coming in this nation. And so over months of debate, while no one gets everything they want, I think it's important that we talk about the things that we got, that we talk about the things that the American people will get out of this bill that will help start turning the trajectory of our nation's spending in Washington, finally putting our country back on a path where we can keep this debate going. This is the first step. Let's make no mistake about it. This bill doesn't solve all of the problems that have been created over years and decades, but it starts to finally turn the ship of state in the right direction. And it starts with real savings. Over $2 trillion in actual spending cuts. That's in the bill. Again, very historic first step. And it doesn't mean that's where we stop. It means that's where we start. You don't get the next round of trillions in spending cuts if you don't lock in the first $2.1 trillion that are in this bill. Now, something else we do. We actually go and reclaim for the taxpayers of America what's been identified as $28 billion in slush funds floating around Washington, all under the name of COVID. President Biden himself actually said COVID is over. We passed legislation here in this House under this Republican majority to end the pandemic so we can get our country and our economy back going again. Yet there's $28 billion out there still unspent that liberals in Washington want to spend. And if we don't pass this bill, they will spend that money in the name of COVID, even though COVID's over. $28 billion that should go back in savings to the taxpayer. Well, guess what is in this bill, Mr. Speaker? Those $28 billion are reclaimed so the taxpayers get that money back. That's in this bill. Let's talk about the IRS. In my years in public service, in the state level or in Congress, I've never got a single call from a constituent going, you know what? The thing we really, really want you to do is to go add more people to the IRS. Yet President Biden, for some reason, decided he wanted to more than double the size of the IRS, to go from about 80,000 people to add not up to 87,000, but to add an additional 87,000 people. And even according to the Congressional Budget Office, they confirmed that it would break President Biden's promise. You heard it over and over again. If you make less than $400,000 a year, don't worry, you won't pay any more in new taxes. Well, maybe they're redefining what lower income means, because if you're making less than $100,000, according to the CBO, those new IRS agents will be going after you, lower income family workers, the single mom that's working 2 jobs at a restaurant. That's who they'll be going after. And so we step in and say, no, we've got to end that madness. Over $1 billion in cuts to the IRS to stop them from doing just that. Let's talk about another big area of savings. You know, a lot of people take out loans, a loan to buy their first home. I know that's harder today under the Biden economy because interest rates are so high because of the out-of-control spending in Washington that this bill finally starts to address. So hopefully interest rates can go down. So hopefully families can afford to buy their first home again. But there's something else that people do. Usually the first loan a lot of people take out is a student loan. I know I did when I was a student. I signed the document, and it helped me get through college. I also worked my way through college. But when I graduated, there was never a day where I thought somebody else, some single mom working 2 jobs, ought to pay that loan back instead of me. I paid those loans back, and most Americans have done that. About 13% of the American people take out student loans. Yet for some reason, the president decided that he thinks all Americans, 100% of American taxpayers, should pay the student loans of the 13% that don't want to pay them back. Is that fair? Does anybody think that's fair to all of those people who are working hard, barely getting by in a tough economy? And so what we do is we actually start those loan payments back. That's $60 billion in savings just this year, in the first year, so that people don't have to carry the burden for something that somebody else said they would do. This is America. We make our choices. If you want to take out a loan, you should have that ability, but you shouldn't then expect somebody else to go pay it for you. Let's get back to the values that made this country so great. We put real permitting reforms in place, something we haven't seen in decades. Anybody that's trying to build anything in America, if you're trying to build a factory, if you're trying to maybe add on to your farm, if you've got a barn and you want to add on to it, they find a puddle in the back and under waters of the U.S., next thing you know, you got 5 different federal agencies where groups are suing to stop you from getting that permit, even though you've done everything right, you followed all the rules. So we finally fixed that. We create a one-stop shop, so that if you're trying to get a permit, if you're playing by the rules, somebody else can't go game the system to try to kill your project by going to one agency and you spend 2 years fighting that lawsuit, you win that one, the next day they file another lawsuit with another agency and another, and next thing you know, it's 10 years later and you just give up and walk away. It happens all the time in America. By having a one-stop shop, but we also put shot clocks on the unelected bureaucrats. Because you know what, Mr. Speaker, if a federal agency tells you that you have to get them some information back, they don't say, hey, get it to us whenever you want it. They give you a deadline, and it's usually pretty soon. And if you don't meet that deadline, you don't get your permit. But if you get them all the information, you might wait 6 months, a year, or longer to hear back from the federal agency. These are people that work for the taxpayers of America. Shouldn't they have the same requirements and a shot clock on them that they put on you, the American people paying their salaries? That's in this bill. And finally, Mr. Speaker, real work requirements. I don't think there's ever been a time in America where there are more jobs that are open, people looking for workers. You can go to a restaurant if you want to take your family out for a nice dinner, and you're seeing a third of the tables empty, yet they're not seating anybody because they don't have enough workers. Why is that? Because the federal government is paying millions of people right now not to work. Think about that. In America, where everybody's looking for workers, the federal government is borrowing money from countries like China to pay people not to work. This is insanity. And for all the people out there that are working, they're paying that freight. Why don't we say for people who are able-bodied, who are able to get back into the workforce, there's a social safety net for people who run on hard times. But if you just choose to sit at home and turn down jobs, that's your prerogative as American. Don't ask somebody who's working 2 jobs to pay for you to sit at home and turn down work. And by putting work requirements back in place, something Joe Biden himself voted for as a senator, you also strengthen Social Security and Medicare, 2 programs that are going bust under President Biden's runaway spending that we shore up in this bill, actually strengthening those programs that are so important to the people who paid in for it. There's more work to be done, absolutely. And we will get to work tomorrow working on the next round of things we need to do to keep getting this country back on track. But we never get there if we don't start with the first step. That's what we're doing here tonight. That's why we need to get this bill passed and then go work on the next reforms we've got to do to continue strengthening this great nation, the United States of America. I urge passage, and I yield back the balance of my time.
Gentleman yields.
I reserve.
Reserve. Gentleman from Massachusetts.
Thank you, Mr.
recognized.
Speaker. The distinguished majority leader failed to mention that we raised the national debt 3 times during Donald Trump's presidency. He failed to point out that $8.7 trillion was added to the national debt during Donald Trump's presidency. With that, let me yield 1 minute to the distinguished gentleman, a productive member of the Ways and Means Committee, Mr. Pasquarelli.
Gentleman is recognized.
Mr. Chairman, the only problem is our tax system is broken, and you don't want to talk about it. We made strides to fix this problem with an historic IRS investment. The IRS is coming after you. I saw those commercials. You're better than that, guys and gals. You're better than that. No one's putting an army together. But we want to make sure everybody pays their fair share. What in God's name is wrong with that? And that's what we're talking about. And if you look at the IRS estimates of those people who are getting away with murder, that's what the average American knows about, thinks about, but does little talking about, because he figures he can't do anything about it.
Gentleman's time has expired. Gentleman's time has expired.
I'm sorry? I'm sorry?
Gentleman's recognized.
30 seconds.
So, Article 1 is ignored many times by both parties, both sides of the aisle. It is the Congress that has the power to put a budget together. It's pretty simple. All Americans must understand what is happening here. President Biden put forward a budget to boost opportunity for working Americans, increase access to health care, and
Gentleman's time has expired.
Tax fairness. And Mr. Chairman, in the greatest country in the world, If we don't fix our tax
Gentleman's
system,
time has expired.
we have not done our job as Congress folks. Thank you, and I yield back.
As a reminder, members are reminded to direct their remarks to the chair. Does the gentleman reserve?
Speaker.
Gentleman from Missouri is recognized.
Mr. Speaker, Democrats often say that the new IRS funding will only be used to go after the wealthy. This is simply not the case. I ask for unanimous consent to submit for the record a CBO blog post from 2021 examining the Biden administration's $80 billion proposal and stating that it would return the audit rates to the levels of about 10 years ago and that rate would rise for all taxpayers. Our calculations show that this would mean 600,000 more audits per year for taxpayers making less than $75,000 a year.
Without objection.
I yield 1.5 minutes to the gentleman from Pennsylvania, Mr. Kelly.
Gentleman is recognized.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. You know, I come from a town called Butler, Pennsylvania, and in that area, it's Pennsylvania's 16th congressional district. In that district, the average annual income for a family of 4 is about $52,000. Now, down here, people laugh and say, nobody can live on $52,000 a year. I said, in my district, they do. In my district, they do. But let's talk about this in kitchen table economics. Last year, we had about $4.9 trillion in revenue. We spent $6.2 trillion. Kitchen table economics is that you tell that family that earned $49,000, go out and spend $62,000, and they look at you like there's something wrong with your head, and they say, you can't do that. I said, your government does. Your government does. They do it every year, and they do it with your tax dollars. Listen, this is America's wake-up call. This isn't about the blue side of the house or the red side of the house. Look up in the gallery. That's red, white, and blue. That is America. Those are the people that pay our taxes. All we're asking tonight is we look at the Fiscal Responsibility Act. What a weird name to be used in Washington. I wish we could stop playing this game of who struck John. Both parties have spent too much money for far too long. Tonight's the night to turn this ship around. This is the USS Abraham Lincoln, and it takes more than one person at the wheel. We've all got to grab that wheel, and we've got to start pulling on that wheel to turn this ship around.
Gentleman's time has expired.
Thank you. I appreciate the time, but I got to tell you, tonight's a wake-up call, America. Not a Republican wake-up call or a Democrat wake-up call, but an American wake-up call. Please, wake up.
Does the gentleman reserve?
Reserve.
Gentleman from Massachusetts is recognized.
Thank you. They're applauding for me, Mr. Speaker. Thank you. Mr. Speaker, with that, I'd like to recognize the distinguished gentleman, member of the Ways and Means Committee from Illinois, Mr. Davis, for 1 minute.
Gentleman's recognized.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. I commend President Biden, Leader Jefferson, all of our negotiators for the great work they've done to keep us from defaulting on our debts. This agreement protects critical funding for children and families, and especially am I pleased with the protections for homeless youth in school, foster children who've aged out of care, and veterans in need of health services. It protects Medicare, Medicaid, Social Security. This bill protects historic investments in clean energy. It also protects the 40 million student loan borrowers under President Biden's student loan relief plan, and it provides relief for some of my concerns about SNAP and work benefits and work requirements in TANF. I still have some serious concerns about how it affects the environment and responds to climate control issues. The bill is not everything I wanted, but it does give us an opportunity to pay our debt and protect the good work we've done during the first term of President Biden.
Gentleman's time has
Thank
expired.
you, Mr. Speaker, and yield back.
Is the gentleman reserved?
We continue to reserve, Mr. Speaker.
Gentleman from Missouri is recognized.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. I yield 2 minutes to the gentleman from Texas, the Budget Chairman, Mr. Arrington.
Gentleman's recognized.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. As I have repeatedly warned, the fiscal state of our nation is in decline. Our financial health is rapidly deteriorating, and our national debt is unsustainable. And by the way, both parties bear some blame. But one thing is for sure, Mr. Speaker, we didn't get here overnight, and we won't get out of this mess with just one piece of legislation. Here's my admonition to my colleagues. This can't just be a one-off deal. It must be the beginning of a movement to restore fiscal sanity in our nation's capital. We must end the era of big government funded on the backs of our children and change the culture in Washington to continuously and repeatedly rein in our out-of-control deficit spending. But today, there's only one deal on the table and only one question for me and my colleagues to answer. Do the biggest cuts to the wasteful and bloated bureaucracy, record rescissions of federal funds, and reforms to welfare and environmental regulations constitute a meaningful step in the right direction? Mr. Speaker, the answer is unequivocally yes. As I've said all along, we will pay our bills, we will protect the good faith and credit of the United States, but we will not give politicians a blank check to bankrupt our country. The American people gave Republicans the majority in the House to stop our Democrat colleagues' unbridled spending and reverse Biden's failed economic policies, and I believe the Fiscal Responsibility Act is certainly a good start, which is why I support this piece of legislation, and I urge my colleagues to do the same, and I yield back.
Gentleman yields. Is the gentleman reserve?
Reserve.
Gentleman.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Let me recognize the gentlelady from Alabama, a very capable member of the Ways and Means Committee, Ms. Sewell, for 1 minute.
Gentlelady is recognized.
Mr. Speaker, I rise in support of the bipartisan budget agreement in order to protect Medicare, Medicaid, and Social Security while also preventing a devastating default on our debt. To be clear, this bill is far from perfect, but it prevents a default. It prevents future efforts to hold this nation hostage for the rest of the 118th Congress, and it prevents cruel Republican cuts. This budget agreement that President Biden negotiated funding for education, health care, veterans benefits, Medicare, Medicaid, and Social Security. Most importantly, it prevents Republicans from forcing a devastating default that would kill countless jobs in my district and destroy our economy. Mr. Speaker, I join in expressing my frustration with the crisis that my Republican colleagues have manufactured. The American people deserve better than a Republican majority that chooses to govern crisis by crisis. Let's lift this debt ceiling and get on with the people's business in the people's house. Thank you, and I yield back the balance of my time.
Gentleman from Massachusetts reserves.
We continue to reserve, Mr. Speaker.
Gentleman from Massachusetts reserves. Gentleman from Missouri is recognized.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. I yield 1.5 minutes to the gentleman from Pennsylvania, Mr. Smucker.
Gentleman from Pennsylvania is recognized for 1.5 minutes.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker, and I thank the chairman for yielding. Mr. Speaker, I rise today in support of the Fiscal Responsibility Act. How could I not support a bill that claws back billions in unspent COVID funds? A bill that cuts trillions in Biden's out-of-control spending. A bill that caps spending levels for years to come. And a bill that enacts work requirements to bring more Americans back into the workforce, lift households out of poverty by connecting them with the best anti-poverty job program, a good job. And most importantly, this bill begins. It's a start to put our nation on a better fiscal trajectory. Our debt to GDP today is at the highest level ever since the end of World War II. If we do nothing to curb spending, our federal debt will be double our GDP by 2050. This is a start to change our trajectory. Now, I wish I could be voting for more than this. I liked our original bill a heck of a lot better. But fact is, the president and the Democrats who control the Senate fought hard to maintain their spending addiction. Given that we only control the House, I'm very pleased with all that is in this bill. It's most definitely an improvement over existing law, and I'm disappointed that some of my colleagues don't see that. This bill will give our creditors the confidence that we can govern by putting us on a better path. It's a step in the right direction, and I'm proud to support it.
Gentleman from Missouri reserves.
Reserves.
Gentleman from Massachusetts is recognized.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. There isn't anybody in this chamber who believes that Republicans will abide by a cap on defense spending in the next year. Let me yield 1 minute to the distinguished gentlelady from Washington, Congresswoman Delbene, a champion of the child tax credit.
The gentlelady is recognized for 1 minute.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. I rise today in support of the bipartisan budget agreement. This deal will protect American families and our economy from a devastating default on our nation's bills in just 5 days. It will also shield our veterans, seniors, law enforcement, and schools from the worst of the extreme demands my Republican colleagues issued while holding our economy hostage. This deal is far from perfect, but we can't let perfect be the enemy of the good when the stakes are this high. A default would mean an immediate recession, millions of jobs lost, devastating retirement accounts, and higher borrowing costs for Americans. Compromise means that no one gets everything they want. So we have a choice between a catastrophic outcome or a chance to move forward with a bipartisan compromise. The worst outcome here would be a default. So let's get this done and over to the Senate so we can take default off the table. I yield back.
Gentleman from Massachusetts reserves.
Continue to reserve.
The gentleman from Missouri is recognized.
I yield 1.5 minutes to the gentlelady from New York, Ms. Malliotakis.
The gentlelady is recognized for 1.5 minutes.
Mr. Speaker, the Rolling Stones said, you can't always get what you want, you get what you need. And we need to avert a default that would stop checks to our seniors, benefits for our veterans, hurt the U.S. dollar, and Americans' retirement savings. We also need to change the fiscal trajectory of our nation, and this bill does both by reducing inflationary spending for the first time in over a decade with the largest savings in history, imposing spending caps and adding checks and balances on the executive branch. We started from a place where the President and the Senate refused to negotiate, and we ended with conservative wins. That includes stopping Biden's plan to hire additional IRS agents this year, clawing back unused COVID funds, expanding work requirements to reduce dependency on public benefits, and cutting costly red tape that slows down critical infrastructure projects. While no deal is perfect, this is only the beginning, and we cannot allow the perfect to be the enemy of the good. Republicans under the leadership of Speaker McCarthy have restored balance to government. We've put an end to the Democrats' massive inflationary spending sprees, and we will continue to fight for the American taxpayers as we proceed in this process to stop reckless policies that fuel inflation. I yield back.
Gentleman from Missouri reserves.
Reserves.
The House will come to order.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker, for order.
Will members take their conversations off the floor? The House will come to order. Thank you. The gentleman from Massachusetts is recognized.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. A very capable woman, a member of the Ways and Means Committee, is the gentlelady from Wisconsin, Congresswoman Moore, for 1 minute.
Gentlelady is recognized for 1 minute.
Thank you so much. Republicans claim that they just had to threaten the economic well-being of every American man, woman, and child because of the $31 trillion debt was too high. Well, hypocrisy thou hast to name, GOP, because what they insisted on, their red line, was not financial at all. It was to double down on the so-called work requirements. Thank God the White House negotiations pushed back on the worst of these changes in TANF that would have saved $6 million over 10 years. No, speaker after speaker has insisted on denying food to poor, old women who are primarily black and brown. It seems like the pound of flesh that you get is more delicious than having savings. But just wait. Before the ink is dry on this bill, you will be pushing for $3.5 trillion in business tax cuts. Watch my word. You heard it here first. I yield back.
Gentleman from Massachusetts reserves. Gentleman from Massachusetts reserves.
Continue to reserve, Mr. Speaker.
The gentleman from Missouri is recognized.
I yield 1 minute to the gentleman from Pennsylvania, Mr. Muser.
Gentleman from Pennsylvania is recognized for 1 minute. Thank you, Mr. Speaker. I thank the chairman very much. Mr. Speaker, while the Fiscal Responsibility Act is not perfect, and God knows we need serious corrections, but there are at least 10 conservative American provisions in this bill that will benefit our economy and advance a higher level of fiscal responsibility. And let's be honest, this is the most conservative bill that can pass with a Biden White House and a Schumer Senate. The Fiscal Responsibility Act stops the excessive spending, stops the bleeding, and adds to our workforce with work requirements. It includes the most important federal environmental permitting reforms in 40 years. And don't take my word for it. This is coming from the Associated General Contractors of America, the Petroleum Institute, the Marcellus Shale Coalition, and the National Association of Manufacturers. Virtually every small business association, every group committed to sound fiscal policy, such as Americans for Tax Reform and Americans for Prosperity, have endorsed this legislation. This bill reins in the Biden administration's executive order spending, which accounted for over $1 trillion in spending over the last 2 years. There's also a reduction of the IRS of $20 billion, protect Social Security, and all the while we will avoid a catastrophic default. I urge support of this bill. Thank you, Mr. Speaker.
Gentleman from Missouri continues to reserve.
I reserve.
Gentleman from Massachusetts is recognized.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. I yield 1 minute to the gentleman from Michigan, Congressman Kildee, whose voice and health have been returned.
The gentleman from Michigan is recognized for 1 minute.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker, and thank you to my friend, the ranking member, for that. Look, paying America's bills isn't an option. Defaulting on our debt would have a consequence for every single American, and in fact would have global consequences. It would increase every family's costs, eliminate millions of jobs, threaten the retirement security of seniors and families all across this country. Let me be clear. We shouldn't be in this position. We shouldn't be close to default. It's a manufactured crisis. The House Republican majority created this crisis because they didn't have the will to submit their ideas to the legislative process, rather holding us all hostage to exact this price, to exact this legislation, when we could have simply gone through the legislative process of making decisions about the priorities for this country. They have the majority on the Appropriations Committee, on the Ways and Means Committee, on the Budget Committee. They ought not fear the argument over these issues. We need to make sure that we accept the fact that we've come to a compromise that protects Medicare, Medicaid, protects the American people from catastrophic default. I urge my colleagues to support
Gentleman's
this
time has expired. Gentleman from Massachusetts reserves. Gentleman from Missouri is recognized.
I yield 1 minute to the gentleman from California, Mr. McClintock.
Gentleman from California, you're recognized for 1 minute.
Thank you. Mr. Speaker, this is the first time in my 15 years in Congress that I've voted to increase the debt limit. I do so today because this measure places real constraints on future spending, more than $2 trillion. That makes this bill the most important victory for fiscal conservatism in more than a decade. The debt is but a symptom of the central problem, reckless spending. Once we've spent $1, there are only 3 ways to pay for it: taxes, inflation, or debt. It's the spending stupid. We've got a long way to go. But until the American people have had enough and replaced the President and the Senate majority, this is a remarkable step forward. And the many pro-growth provisions in the bill provide the most potent antidote to debt: economic expansion. Defeating this bill would create a financial and political panic that will quickly forfeit the many hard-won reforms that are in this bill. We cannot let that happen.
Gentleman from Missouri reserves.
Reserves.
Gentleman from Massachusetts is recognized.
I yield 1 minute to the very capable gentleman from Virginia, a member of the Ways and Means Committee, Congressman Beyer.
Gentleman is recognized for 1 minute.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Mr. Speaker, I rise in support of this imperfect bill. Look, I would much rather have voted for a clean debt limit increase, as we did 3 times under the previous president. And I do believe it's profoundly wrong. The Republicans chose to hold our economy hostage, using the American people as leverage to demand concessions, and it was unnecessary. We're in a divided House. They have all the leverage they need to negotiate this through the regular appropriations process. You know, our values sometimes overlap, but they don't here when they want to protect the wealthiest tax cheats, and we just want everyone to pay their fair share. Look, President Biden and his negotiating team worked skillfully and successfully to prevent a majority of the draconian tax cuts. This bill could have been so much worse, but it would be a catastrophe if we didn't pass it. I will vote yes, and I continue to urge my colleagues to permanently abolish the debt ceiling, which could cause a real disaster someday soon if we don't get rid of it. Thank you, and I yield back.
Gentleman from Massachusetts
Continue
reserve.
Mr. Speaker.
Gentleman from Missouri is recognized.
I yield 1.5 minutes to the gentleman from New York, Mr. Lawler.
Gentleman is recognized for 1.5 minutes.
Thank you, Chairman. Thank you, Mr. Speaker. I rise today to voice my support for the Fiscal Responsibility Act. As I have said from the very beginning, we must negotiate, we must cut spending, and we cannot default. The FRA reduces discretionary spending for the first time in decades and is the largest deficit reduction in our nation's history. It cuts non-defense and non-veteran spending to below 2022 levels, one of the primary goals of the Limit, Save, and Grow Act. It saves taxpayers $2.1 trillion over the next 6 years while blocking $5 trillion in new taxes proposed by the Biden administration. The bill also caps spending at 1% growth over the next 6 years, and through the appropriations process, House Republicans will have the opportunity to reduce spending even more. That will help us take on the Biden administration's reckless spending head-on, crack down on record inflation, and get our economy on the right track. This bill also protects Social Security, Medicare, and veterans' benefits, despite previous false claims by my Democratic colleagues that we were going to cut those vital programs. It enacts critical permitting and NEPA reform, enacts safeguards on executive spending, and forces Congress to engage in a functional appropriations process. The bottom line is this: with a divided government, no party is going to get 100% of what it wants. We all have a responsibility to govern, and default is not an option. The Fiscal Responsibility Act puts us on the path to fiscal sanity, protects our commitments to veterans and seniors, and raises the debt ceiling so we will not default.
Time has expired.
That's a bill we should all support, and I will vote aye.
Gentleman from Missouri reserves.
Reserve.
Gentleman from Massachusetts is
Thank you,
recognized.
Mr. Speaker. Pleased to yield 1 minute to the very capable gentleman from Philadelphia, Pennsylvania, Congressman Evans.
Mr. Speaker,
Gentleman is recognized for 1 minute.
Mr. Speaker, this bill is far from perfect. However, the full faith and credit of the United States is at risk, and we cannot let Republicans drive us to default. Defaulting on the national debt would disrupt Social Security benefits for 92,000 households in my congressional district. I will not stand by and let harm come to our nation, seniors and people disabled. I urge my colleagues not to draw out this debt crisis and instead return to our focus of lowering the cost for working families. I yield back, Mr. Speaker.
Massachusetts reserves. Gentleman from Missouri is recognized.
Mr. Speaker, I reserve.
I'm sorry?
I reserve.
Gentleman from Missouri reserves.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. We have a breakdown of the time.
Gentleman from Massachusetts has 10 minutes. The gentleman from Missouri has 4 minutes.
Thank you. Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Let me yield 1 minute to another very capable member of the Ways and Means Committee, the gentleman from Illinois, Mr. Snyder.
For how much time?
Thank you, Mr. Speaker.
1 minute.
Gentleman from Illinois is recognized for 1 minute.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. I rise today in support of the bipartisan budget agreement and President Biden's work to ensure the nation pays our bills and avoids catastrophic, self-inflicted economic crisis. This legislation protects the many bipartisan achievements realized in the last Congress, such as the Infrastructure Investment and Jobs Act, CHIPS and Science Act, and PACT Act, as well as the Inflation Reduction Act with its historic investments in addressing climate change. With this vote, we will protect Social Security, Medicare, and Medicaid, and prevent devastating cuts sought to life-sustaining SNAP and TANF programs. With this vote, we will keep America moving forward to meet the challenges ahead of us. Compromise requires give and take, and both sides make difficult concessions to achieve this agreement. This is the result of bipartisan deal-making, and I look forward to holding up the President's side of this bargain. I hope this is a learning moment and we can avoid future political brinksmanship. I urge all my colleagues to put the American people over politics and support this important bill. Thank you, Mr. Speaker. I yield back the balance of my time.
Gentleman yields back. Gentleman from Massachusetts reserves. Gentleman from Missouri is recognized.
I reserve, Mr. Speaker.
Gentleman from Missouri continues to reserve. Gentleman from Massachusetts.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Let me yield 1 minute again to a very capable member of the Ways and Means Committee, the gentleman from California, Congressman Panetta, for 1 minute.
Gentleman from California is recognized for 1 minute.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. I support the bipartisan budget agreement to raise the debt ceiling. Because if we don't, we will devastate the global markets and undermine the faith of the world's most important financial system, the United States of America. I support a clean raising of the debt ceiling, but elections have consequences. And my colleagues on the other side wanted to use their leverage for concessions. And so, in a divided government, governing means compromise, and it gets us this bill. Legislation that would, would raise the debt ceiling until 2025. 2, the bill would stop the drastic cuts desired by the Republicans, and it would protect Social Security, Medicare, and Medicaid. And although it limits SNAP for certain ages, it expands those types of benefits for veterans and our homeless. And finally, we protect the historic legislation that we passed last Congress to invest in our infrastructure, our manufacturing, reduce our drug costs, and care for veterans. And part of this bill even furthers our transition to clean energy. So I will vote for this bill, but we have a lot more to do if we want to get serious about reducing our debt and deficit. But that only begins when we stop governing by crisis and start governing by leadership. Thank you, Mr. Speaker. I yield back.
Gentleman from Massachusetts continues to reserve. Gentleman from Missouri.
I yield 1 minute to the gentleman from Texas, Mr. Pfluger.
Gentleman from Texas is recognized for 1 minute.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. I rise today on behalf of my district, most important energy district in the country, and on behalf of American energy independence, and on behalf of all Americans who are searching for a reasonable solution to a looming crisis. There are approximately right now 229 major fossil fuel projects in the United States currently awaiting permit approval. A recent study found that $157 billion in energy investment was stuck in the NEPA pipeline, and that simply a 2-year NEPA deadline would spur $67 billion in energy investment. Killing energy projects by the bureaucratic red tape nightmare and the slow walking that we've seen is unacceptable. No more. I'm extremely proud of the energy reforms, the NEPA reforms, the EPA reforms in this bill, the first in over 40 years, which will speed up over 200 projects to lower costs for consumers and protect our national security. No, this bill is not perfect, and arguably it shouldn't be. A divided government yields compromise, and it slows the heavy hand of government. But saving $2 trillion, lifting families out of poverty, and defunding IRS agents is worth it. Vote yes for America's energy independence.
Gentleman's time's expired. Chair, I recognize the gentleman from Massachusetts.
Mr. Speaker, I want to yield 1 minute to the distinguished gentlelady from the Virgin Islands, an alum of the Ways and Means Committee, Congresswoman Plaskett.
Gentlelady from the Virgin Islands recognized for 1 minute.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Through Democrats' leadership, Democrats have protected our hard-earned and historic economic recovery. That team secured an agreement that prevents Republicans from forcing devastating default and rejects their most extreme cuts in the GOP Default in America bill. President Biden's agreement protected Social Security, Medicare, Medicaid, veterans' health care. This was a negotiation with individuals whose prime priority was cutting food assistance and protecting the wealthy. And that was their main priority across the entire negotiation. Fiscal responsibility, their only responsibility was to protect their tax cuts for ultra-wealthy that grew the debt to $7 trillion in the first place. The president successfully insisted that this agreement was going to include time limits on SNAP. It needed to include meaningful improvements to SNAP. Republicans protected the wealthy at the feet of the neediest Americans.
Gentlelady's time's expired.
Democrats understand the needs of the American people and our most vulnerable Americans, as well as the full faith and credit of the American people.
Gentlelady's no longer recognized. Gentleman from Massachusetts reserves. Gentleman from Missouri is recognized.
Mr. Speaker, I'd like to remind my colleagues that because of the Republican Tax Cut and Jobs Act, the bottom 20% of earners saw their average federal tax rate fall to its lowest level in 40 years. Low and middle income families of four saved at least $2,000 on their tax bill each year. I reserve.
Gentleman from Missouri continues to reserve. Gentleman from Massachusetts.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Let me recognize the distinguished gentleman from Georgia, the ranking member on the Agricultural Committee, Mr. Scott, for 1 minute.
Thank you very much,
Chairman.
Chairman.
Recognized.
Ladies and gentlemen, this is a most historic night.
Gentlemen will suspend. The House will be in order. Gentleman needs to be heard.
Thank you.
Gentleman's recognized.
First of all, I want to thank President Biden. President Biden invited me, along with the other leaders, ranking member and chairman of our Agriculture Committee. And it gave me a chance to talk straight to the president about the serious food shortage that's coming to our veterans. Right now, when I told him, and many of you may not know this, but the veterans are living in more insecure food households than anybody else, a 7.4% higher than the general public. And when I told President Biden that, he said, we got to do something about it. And that's when he moved with his energy to be able to take not only the veterans, but SNAP and others off of SNAP work requirements.
Gentleman's time's
God
expired.
bless this president for his leadership.
Gentleman's time's expired. Chair will remind members that they need to remove their conversations from the floor. The speakers deserve to be heard. Gentleman from Missouri is recognized.
Mr. Speaker, I reserve.
Gentleman continues to reserve. Gentleman from Massachusetts is recognized.
Let me recognize the distinguished gentleman from Indiana, Mr. Mervyn, for 1 minute.
Gentleman from Indiana is recognized for 1 minute.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. I ran for Congress to solve problems, and this legislation averts a crisis. A default would jeopardize millions of people with unemployment, increase credit ratings or increase interest rates, and risk retirees and devastate their 401ks. A default would also jeopardize numerous investments in the American worker in the 117th Congress, including the Infrastructure Investment and Jobs Act. This bill not only increased created jobs, but it also, with a strong Buy American provision, strengthened our domestic steel and manufacturing base, and it also allows for our members, our veterans, to be protected and puts funds dedicated to the health benefits and provides resources for the Toxic Exposure Fund. I appreciate the dedicated work of the administration and the Democratic colleagues. For my neighbor Gretchen, who had anxiety about her 401k, this bill supports the American worker. It supports the American industry, the steel industry, and it also
Gentleman's time's expired.
Protects the American dream. I'm voting yes.
Gentleman from Missouri is recognized.
I reserve, Mr. Speaker.
Gentleman from Missouri reserves. Gentleman from Massachusetts
Mr. Speaker,
is
could I
recognized.
inquire as to how much time?
Gentleman from Massachusetts has 5 minutes remaining.
Okay.
Gentleman from Missouri has 2.5 minutes.
We're waiting on one speaker, and I'd like to move this along, depending on what the chairman's position is.
Prepared to close. We're prepared to
After
close.
that, you're prepared to close?
Yes.
Not here. We're prepared to close.
Gentleman from Massachusetts is recognized for closing.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. I think that this has been an elevating conversation about how we arrived here tonight. Our colleagues on the other side, they voted for the infrastructure bill, they voted for the CHIPS Act, they voted for the CARES Act, they voted for the defense spending increases, and they voted for a tax cut in 2017 that borrowed $2.3 trillion that was added to the national debt. Now, for those who might be paying attention tonight, the national debt is the cumulative effect of deficits. These were annual deficits that were run up. Neither party is responsible for the pandemic. On March 11th of 2020, we were warned what was coming. 20 million jobs evaporated. Tonight, in some measure because of the leadership of Joe Biden, every one of those jobs has been returned, and 9.5 million jobs go unanswered. In this negotiation, which means you don't get everything you want, there are some quality moments that we take great credit for. We defended Social Security, despite the fact there were 3 Republican senators who proposed cuts to Social Security. That's the reality. We defended Medicare. We defended Medicaid, and we defended veterans' benefits. and very proud of the fact that we wrote the Pandemic Relief Act. There's a group here tonight, I've been here long enough to know this, they were against this before they were against it. They were against it years ago. Never mind tonight. But this moment of bringing the nation to default, what this does, or what it would do to the American dollar as the currency of choice for the world, what this would do in treasury markets for liquidity purposes, what this would do to the hard-earned 401k plans of the American family, to take us to this moment in this showdown that we had. This argument tonight was never about perfection. All 435 members of this House would probably have written a different version of this bill. But in divided government, that's not reality. Now, the last point I want to make is this. In coming days after this righteous debate about balancing the budget, our Republican colleagues are about to offer a massive tax cut. We need to be ready because of the fiscal rectitude that they have offered on this floor tonight. So the corresponding responsibility of all of us is to point out what they intend to do with another tax cut. 201, $1.3 trillion. And by the way, with 2 wars and 2 million more veterans that we need to support. Now, the other reality is back in 2003, another $1 trillion of tax cuts. And the worst one of all, that tax cut in December of 2017, where they borrowed $2.3 trillion for a tax cut that went to the wealthiest among us and had very meager economic growth. So this debate tonight was a good and spirited one because we also have, I think, found a common purpose in passing this legislation. But let's engage this debate going forward. If we want the things that we say they want, we're going to have to pay for them. And that means at some point revisiting these tax cuts that have been put on the table in an arbitrary fashion, and as I noted, with borrowed money. I yield back the balance of my time.
The gentleman from Massachusetts yields back the balance of his time. The gentleman from Missouri is recognized.
You know, Mr. Speaker, we hear the other side of the aisle over and over talk about the Tax Cut and Jobs Act. Well, let me tell you about the Tax Cut and Jobs Act. Last year, we had record revenue into the United States of $4.9 trillion, which was $900 billion plus more than what Joint Tax and CBO predicted what would happen upon passage of the Tax Cut and Jobs Act. The Tax Cut and Jobs Act delivered for a family of 4 who makes less than $60,000 a year that they pay 0 in federal taxes.
Gentlemen will suspend. The House will be in order. Members will remove their conversations from the floor. The gentleman deserves to be heard. The gentleman is recognized.
But, Mr. Speaker, let's talk about tax cuts. The other side passed something called the Inflation Reduction Act, and it was tax cuts for their wealthy donors. In fact, the CBO just came out with a new score saying that it cost over $700 billion. But guess what? 90% of your tax credits go to corporations with more than $1 billion in revenues. And it goes to $125 billion to China. That is what your tax cuts did. After years of Washington running in the wrong direction, we have an opportunity to take meaningful steps in the right direction on addressing America's debt crisis. The American people deserve nothing less. They see what inflation caused by reckless spending of the Democrat Party has done to their family budgets, to their retirement security, and to their small business plans. We have the opportunity to end the constant doling out of tax dollars under the guise of COVID relief. We have the opportunity to downsize the $80 billion pay raise that was given to the IRS last year. The IRS does not need a raise. It needs a reckoning. We have the opportunity to support those who can work, to find work and climb out of poverty. We have the opportunity to put some guardrails on the administration so if they are going to spend tax dollars by executive fiat, they have to find savings somewhere else. We have the opportunity and the responsibility to address our debt crisis as we address the debt ceiling. Yield back, Mr. Speaker.
The gentleman from Missouri yields back his balance of his time. Members are reminded to direct their remarks to the chair. All time for debate has expired pursuant to House Resolution 456. The previous question is ordered on the bill as amended. Question is on engrossment and third reading of the bill. Those in favor say aye. Those opposed say no. The ayes have it. Third reading.
Provide for a responsible increase to the debt ceiling.
The question is on passage of the bill. Those in favor say aye. Those opposed say no. Aye. No. In the opinion of the chair, the ayes have it. Without objection. Purpose is the gentleman from Massachusetts asked for a recorded vote. Those in favor of a recorded vote will rise. Sufficient number having arisen, a recorded vote is ordered. Members will record their votes by electronic device. Pursuant to Clause 9 of Rule 20, this 15-minute vote on passage of the bill will be followed by a 5-minute vote on the motion to suspend the rules and pass H.R. 2797. This is a 15-minute vote. yeas are 314. The nays are 117. The bill is passed. Without objection, a motion to reconsider is laid on the table. Pursuant to Clause 8 of Rule 20, the unfinished business is the vote on the motion of the gentlewoman from Missouri, Ms. Wagner, to suspend the rules and pass H.R. 2797 as amended, on which the yeas and nays are ordered. The clerk will report the title.
H.R. 2797, a bill to amend the Securities Act of 1933 to require certification examinations for accredited investors and for other purposes.
The question is, will the House suspend the rules and pass the bill as amended? Members will record their votes by electronic device. This is a 5-minute vote. vote, the yeas are 383, the nays are 18. Two-thirds being in the affirmative, the rules are suspended, the bill is passed, and without objection, the motion to reconsider is laid on the table. Chair lays before the House a communication.
The Honorable the Speaker, House of Representatives, sir. I write to inform you that I am resigning my position as the member of the United States Congress representing the 1st Congressional District of Rhode Island, effective at the close of the legislative day of May 31st, 2023. It has been the honor of my lifetime to represent the 1st Congressional District of Rhode Island in the United States House of Representatives, and I am eternally grateful for their trust and faith that the people of the 1st District placed in me to serve as their member of Congress for the past 12 years. Enclosed, find a copy of the letter I have submitted to the Rhode Island Governor, Daniel J. McKee. Signed sincerely, David N. Cicilline, Member of Congress.
Pursuant to Section 3Z of the House Resolution 5, the House stands in adjournment until 11 a.m. tomorrow.